Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Skeptic Skeleton Sunday Streams. Unfortunately, as the very few of you who actually watch this have noticed, I had to take last week off due to an illness that was not pandemic related. But I'm back and rested and better than ever, and back ready to get into our boss rush rapid fire speed round of videos. So these videos aren't necessarily that long, but oh boy, is there a lot to talk about in them. So let's get into it. Starting off with 6 proofs for God's existence. You know, we have to start basic. This is a very basic channel. So of course we have to start off with the most basic theist point ever, proving God exists.
Socrates once stated that we should follow the argument wherever it leads. When we look at the most profound question of life, does God exist? We should certainly follow his advice.
Shouldn't we follow his advice on every given subject? The way you phrase that is as if to imply that we should be doing this primarily in regards to God's existence, but not necessarily with regards to everything else. And I don't know why that would be the case.
When we do, we'll find evidences that show us God is real.
All right, this is just a nitpick, but I don't think I commonly or ever hear people say the phrase evidences. People usually say evidence or a compilation of evidence, but never evidences. But that's a nitpick. Do go on.
Let's look at 6 proofs that show God exists.
Are we talking about evidence or are we talking about proofs? Because those are not the same thing. And if you were going to talk about proofs, why did you feel the need to bring up the evidence?
Number 1, the universe must have a cause.
Why?
The most fundamental law of science is the law of cause and effect.
Okay, if you say so, I'm not necessarily convinced that that's a law of science. I'd like to see where you got that from. What scientists said that? What scientific study or paper or journal or anything refers to the scientific law of cause and effect? I genuinely want to know where you got that from as a scientific law.
And it says that for every material effect we see, there is a cause that came before it or was simultaneous to it, and that is greater than it.
Okay, so this is what I mean. This is a short video, but there's a lot to unpack with just that one part. So, first of all, every material effect we see. Where's this quote coming from? Because you put it in quotations as if these are not your own words, but someone else's words. But then that begs the question of whose words are they? And I see no reason to strictly limit this law to material effects. And I don't know what it would mean for this law to not apply in any capacity, let alone in an immaterial effect capacity, whatever that even means. And to say that for every material effect we see, there is a cause that came before it or was simultaneous to it doesn't make sense. How can something cause something simultaneous to itself? The entire principle or the entire understanding of something being a cause is that it is causing something else. And for those things to happen at the same time, I don't understand what that means. To be clear, I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm just saying I'm having a difficulty understanding what that means in the context that it's being presented. Not that it definitely 100% can't happen, just that it's very confusing. And then the whole that is greater to it, greater is a quantification of some sort. And you have to give some sort of context to quantifications or else they don't mean anything. One doesn't mean anything by itself. It has to be one of something. It has to refer to something else. It can't just be. When you have addition, you can't just have addition. There has to be things being added. When it comes to these kinds of quantifications that make some sort of value judgment, well, not judgment, but some sort of value discovery, they have to refer to something. So when you say it's greater than it, in what sense is it greater? And how can you test the greatness of a cause against its effect?
The universe is a material effect. So what caused the universe? You see, if you don't believe in a creator, then you have to suggest.
I just want to say I'm not convinced that the universe is a material effect. Why can't the universe be a material cause?
Something like.
Now let's go back a little bit.
Effect. So what caused the universe? You see, if you don't believe in a creator, then you have to suggest something like a singularity. That's what is popular today, that there was some type of singularity that exploded in something called the Big Bang.
Okay, and follow me on this one, and correct me if my understanding is mistaken, but the singularity was the universe. There is not a relevant distinction between the singularity and the universe. The universe is just the singularity in a different form. The singularity exploding as an analogy is fine, I guess, but it's more like an expansion. When you blow up a balloon, it doesn't really explode, it just expands. And that's more or less what happened with the universe, as far as I understand it.
But then when you try to get down to the bottom of what's a singularity, well, what we hear from the scientific community that.
Which scientific community? Because I really feel like you should be asking the cosmologists and not the biologists. You should be very specific about which scientific community you're getting your information from.
And suggest to us the cosmologists, they say, well,
oh, so you were talking about cosmologists. Then why didn't you just say cosmologists? But nitpick.
Singularity was something that popped into existence from nothing.
Which one? Which cosmologist says that? Which cosmological study or journal says that the singularity is something that popped into existence from nothing? First of all, that answer doesn't answer the actual question. It just tells you what the singularity did or where it came from. It doesn't really tell you what it is by itself. But putting that issue aside for a moment, I really want to know where you get your information from. I really want to know which cosmologist said this, and I want to know why they said this too. Not just some random quote from random cosmologist guy, but an actual genuine line of reasoning. Or do you just believe what people say without questioning their reasoning, without looking into their reasoning? I just find it very suspicious that you just say this is a thing that cosmologists say, but you aren't going to tell us which ones say it or why they say it or what they even mean by it.
Do you know that if there ever were a time when there was nothing, that's exactly what we would have now?
Why would you think that? If there was a time where there was nothing, why would that necessarily mean that over a specific given point of time, there would also have to be nothing? Why could there not have been any change in state? Why, if there was nothing then, must there be nothing now? You say that as if that's something that most people just intuitively know, but I don't. So could you explain it a little better?
The idea that something popped into existence from nothing is simply not a scientific idea.
Whether or not it's a scientific idea and whether or not it's an accurate idea are two different things, and I'm primarily concerned with the accuracy. Scientific ideas are updated as new information comes out. The idea that the world was round at one point in time was not a scientific idea, but that didn't make it any less true. And at the end of the day, truth is my primary concern, not how scientific something is. Now, it helps if it's scientific because that can help me understand what it is and what it's supposed to be and how it functions and all that stuff. But it is not the be all and end all. At least not in my humble opinion.
You see, they're suggesting that singularity is somehow natural, but it behaves supernaturally.
No, they're not. They're suggesting that it behaves in a way is like, again, assuming that that random quote you got from God knows where is correct, which is a lot to assume. Assuming all that, That's not what they're saying. They are not saying, therefore, it's supernatural. It could just be a natural process that we don't understand yet. There are a lot of natural processes that we didn't understand before and we would call supernatural. There was a time where people thought lightning was supernatural and came from the gods, when in fact it was just a natural process we don't understand. The same could be applied here. I'm not saying it necessarily is, but it could be, and it seems equally worthy of consideration, as opposed to just saying it's supernatural. I strongly doubt cosmologists who say this will say that this singularity behaved in a supernatural way. Just because something doesn't behave in a natural way doesn't automatically mean it behaves in a supernatural way, unless that's what you mean by supernatural. What you mean by supernatural is just not natural, which seems a bit misleading, but it's your definition, so I guess you can have it.
They say that that singularity wouldn't have followed the laws of nature.
It wouldn't have followed the current laws of nature, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't have followed the laws of nature as they applied and existed back then. The laws of nature don't always function on the same scale in every single context. That's why different things happen in different parts of the universe and at different times and at different places, because there are a lot of different variables that adjust how the laws work. And you are judging something that existed before our current laws by our current laws. And I don't know how you do that. There's no reason to assume that the laws we see in nature, as you would describe it, have applied to before nature was even a thing. How is something supposed to behave in accordance to natural laws before the natural laws came into existence or had anything to apply to? But to be more specific and to be more hyper specific, what natural law specifically did this singularity violate?
Well, then, so what are we left with? We're left with the fact that the universe had a beginning.
No, it didn't, because there's no distinction between the singularity and the universe. It's not like the singularity was there, it exploded, and then the universe appeared. Like one transitioned into the other. They are one and the same. In the same way that a child grows up into an adult, the singularity grew up into a universe. But we wouldn't say that, the adult had a beginning. We might say the human had a beginning, but we wouldn't say the adult had a beginning and that beginning was the child. And even if we did, that would be a bit misleading, don't you think?
And it was not a natural cause, it was something above nature.
Above nature meaning what? Again, you keep using these terms, supernatural or above natural, when as far as I can tell, all these things mean is it's not natural, or at least not natural as far as we currently know.
It was something super nature.
How?
Something supernatural. And so when we see the material effect of the universe, we can know that there was a supernatural creator that caused the universe.
You just went from supernatural to a supernatural creator. That was a really big jump with nothing in between it to substantiate. You basically went, well, as far as we understand, the singularity does not behave in accordance to natural law. Therefore, it isn't natural. Therefore, it's supernatural. Therefore, the universe had a supernatural creator. That seems to be the line of reasoning. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Proof number two.
Wait, that was the proof? That was the proof of God's existence? That had nothing to do with God. At best, we got to the point of a supernatural creator, and a supernatural creator doesn't have to be a God. It could be any number of things taken from Pandora's box of imaginary ideas. Why would it have to necessarily be a God as opposed to an angel that could do that? Or, a other kind of not God, but variation of God with a specific jurisdiction, like the gods in Greek and Roman mythology. I'm not convinced that your God, much less any God, is the only solution to this problem, which I'm not convinced is even a problem. But do go on with the second proof.
Design demands a designer.
I think this is my least favorite argument, but we'll get more into why. If you've seen any of my content, you should know that I hate this argument as I live and breathe. But let's go into why I hate this argument so much.
It is a truism that everybody recognizes that this universe looks designed.
No, it's not. I don't acknowledge that truism. I don't agree with that at all. What would design mean in this context? Design, without a proper definition, could just be thrown out flippantly and applied to anything and everything, which would effectively mitigate its meaning. What would a universe that wasn't designed look like? And then how can we compare our universe to that one? And if you don't have an idea what an undesigned universe would look like, that's part of the problem.
In fact, when we see the various different aspects of nature and
again, various different aspects of nature is very vague and non-specific. It's very difficult for me to imagine a circumstance where there wouldn't be various different states of nature. But if nature was all one way and all behaved in exactly the same way, why couldn't you say it wasn't? Why couldn't you make the point that it was just designed for that? Do you see the problem? You can literally say anything is designed because it's there.
we see birds and squirrels and trees, and we see.
If we didn't see birds and squirrels and trees, would that mean that it wasn't designed? Would that be evidence against design? Because I don't think you would consider it to be that. And what about the absence of various species that used to exist but currently no longer do? Their non-existence isn't evidence against design, but the existence of a squirrel is evidence in favor of it? How?
All of the things that they do so well many times.
What about the times that they don't do those things so well? Because there are times when organisms or entities or things that exist don't necessarily do the thing that it appears that they're functioned to do. This is why medicine is needed in the first place, and surgery is needed in the first place, and various different man-made intervention is necessary. If everything functioned the way it was supposed to, why would we ever need a hospital? Why would we ever need medicine? Why would anyone ever get sick? Why would anyone ever have a missing limb or be born with missing limbs or be born with diseases? Why would any of these things be a problem? Why would someone have asthma if everyone's lungs were designed in the correct way? It does not make sense for everything to be designed, but also except for the times that they're not, or that they don't perform the way that they're supposed to perform.
We as humans, we try to copy and mimic that design, but
Copy and mimic that design. So let's go back. Let's go back.
Humans,
So when we as humans tried to invent the bullet train, we were trying to make a bird, or I'm trying to figure out why. Unless you're suggesting that the kingfisher bird is as fast as a bullet train, but even then, that could still be based on a lot of other things that are fast, not the kingfisher specifically, which I don't know how fast the kingfisher is, which is why I'm avoiding that subject. I find it very interesting that you just put two pictures together that sort of kind of look alike and said that the bullet train is designed after that because they sort of kind of look alike. You didn't really explain why. You just sort of said that that's the basis for the design. You have no way to substantiate that, or at least you've presented nothing. You just said, hey, look at that train. Doesn't it kind of look like that bird? Yeah, we made that train based off that bird. And that's it.
we try to copy and mimic that design, but
Again, it's like, again, suction cups. I don't know the history of suction cups, so I don't know if they're based on the design of the octopus. But you go on a minute here to say that we fail to replicate those things when in fact that might not be our intention. An octopus's suction cups can be very strong, and we might not necessarily want our suction cups to be that strong because we want to be able to move them and attach them, reattach them more easily. So I'm not convinced that we're trying to mimic nature's design. Even if we make something vaguely similar, I don't think our intention is to exactly copy it. Or at least you haven't given any good reason to think that that's our intention.
often we don't do nearly as well as the design that we.
Did you really just say that Velcro was based off of the Avens plant with no evidence? Just none. Just hey, look, this belt, it has things on it that sort of kind of look like hooks, and here's a plant. I'm not going to tell you what this plant is. I'm not going to tell you what it does. I'm not going to tell you how it functions. I'm just going to say it sort of kind of has hooks on its end, and then Velcro sort of kind of has hooks on its end. So obviously one is based on the other.
See in nature. We look at the design of the human body and the human hand and
the ones of us that have hands, because some of us don't.
Arm and the leg and the brain, and we see that those are some of the most advanced, technologically savvy pieces of equipment ever put together. And
you say that, but we don't have a different point of comparison. They are advanced compared to what? And again, what about the humans that either have those things that don't function the way that they're supposed to, or just don't have them at all? What about the humans that don't have legs or don't have working legs, and don't have arms or don't have working arms, or have different kinds of brain deficiencies or mental illness or lots of different things? There's so much wrong with any given human that it seems ridiculous to say that in general it's just this brilliant, marvelous design that messes up as often as it does.
we try to mimic them and copy them, and we can't do it as well.
How do you know whether or not we can do it as well? And how do you know that that's our intention? I'm trying not to repeat myself, but you kind of just say that we're trying to do this thing without demonstrating that that is in fact the goal. Also, there are people that have prosthetic hands, and for them, they work. So, how is that not succeeding? How is that not doing it as well? I'm just not convinced by the things you're saying, because you're just saying things and then moving on without actually demonstrating any of the things you're saying. We try to copy the thing and then we can't copy the thing without proving that we can't copy the thing. Also, you just throw up clips and pictures from God knows where without any context. So I don't even know where this is from or what this has to do with the context of the video. But okay.
Why? Because this universe exhibits design from the starry sky at night.
How is the starry sky at night designed? Genuinely, genuinely, I'm not trying to ask a gotcha question. I want a serious answer to the question: how is the starry sky designed? Because without any explanation, saying it's designed sounds like it does something. And as long as it does something, you can claim it's designed because look, it does something. But that's not good enough. So without a coherent definition of design, you're just saying it's this thing. Look at it, it's this thing. What is that thing? I don't know, but it's the thing. That's how vague you sound to me right now, or to someone who doesn't have a good understanding of what you mean when you say designed. Also, this has nothing to do with the previous point about humans trying to copy design from nature, because now you're just like, well, we try to copy the design of nature because nature is designed. Look at the starry skies, which has nothing to do with the previous point.
To the fingertips on your hand.
What if I don't have fingertips on my hand? Doesn't that drastically undermine your point and point out the flaws in the human design, that it messes up, and that it messes up more often than it should if it was designed not to mess up?
The design is overwhelming. It's everywhere.
Overwhelming? You haven't even explained what the design is. You just give examples of it, but you don't explain what it is. It's like if you tried to give me an example of something tall without telling me what something tall is, and you just start pointing to random things.
Where does design originate? Well, what you and I both know is that when you see things that function and they're complex, that design.
So what you mean by design is something functions in a manner that is complex. But complexity is just like design in that it has to be defined, because you could just call anything complex without a proper, clear definition.
Oh, is that when you see things that function and they're complex, that design comes from an intelligent designer.
How do you know the design comes from an intelligent designer specifically, as opposed to any designer? How do you know it comes from any sort of active designer as opposed to a series of events and factors? When a very complex and complicated crime situation happens, it's not always deliberately orchestrated. It can be a myriad of factors and things that went wrong and all contributed to the scenario in question. It does not mean that every particular facet was intentionally put there. I see no reason to imply that this is any different with design and complexity. I see no reason why we couldn't get something that was designed by a myriad of factors. As a matter of fact, how is that different than how nature just seems to function on its own? Trees just seem to grow on their own without any sort of intervention in any sense. And whether or not they grow depends on a myriad of factors outside of anyone's control. They have to have the appropriate amount of sunlight, water, and assume that their growth isn't hindered by any objects in their way, as well as nature, forest fires, anything. So all of those factors have to be in the right conditions for a tree to grow, and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it grows and it gets set on fire or it gets cut down. Lots of different things happen. My point in all of this is to say the tree is something you would say is designed, but its design seems to be completely autonomous, and whether or not it grows seems to have nothing to do with the tree itself and the myriad of factors surrounding the tree. So where does an intelligent designer come into play when everything we know about how natural things function is relatively independent of an intelligent designer? And that's not even getting into how do you measure the intelligence of the designer.
Big explosions just simply don't bring about order.
Says you. You can say that all you want, but you have to demonstrate that. You have to prove that point. You can't just say big explosions don't bring about order. You have to demonstrate that they don't bring about order. Also, you have to demonstrate that this isn't true in all context or most context, because on Earth, that may or may not be true, but in space, that may or may not function entirely differently. An explosion in space functions entirely differently than an explosion on Earth due to the vast difference in variables. So, who is to say that it doesn't result in order? Not to mention the fact that, again, you are using a lot of terms that you aren't clarifying to your audience and just assuming they know. Complexity, order, design. Without defining what these things are, they don't mean anything.
They don't cause things that are functional and complex.
Why not? When a star explodes into a supernova, it causes either a black hole or a white dwarf, both of which are functional and arguably complex. So what's the problem? I don't understand. And even then, so what if it doesn't? So what if these things don't happen? The beginning of the universe was not an explosion, so all of this is an irrelevant moot point. And if you want to say that it is an explosion, that is a point you have to demonstrate rather than merely say.
To come into existence. The design we see in the universe and complex to come into existence. The design we see in the universe demands a supernatural, intelligent designer.
Why? You've just tacked on supernatural, even though it clearly, obviously doesn't fit with the rest of the argument you were trying to make. But why? Because at the end of the day, I, a very natural human, can design a great many things. That doesn't mean that I am supernatural because I can design natural things.
Proof number 3.
Oh, again, that was supposed to be a proof of God, but it really wasn't. At no point did God come into that. You just kind of jumped in and tacked on supernatural at the end because you remember this was supposed to be an argument about God. But okay, let's keep going.
Life demands a supernatural life giver. You see,
No, it doesn't. I, at one point in time, was alive. Now I'm a skeleton, but I was alive, and that life came from my parents, who were also very much alive and natural. Life seems to create life as far as we can observe at the current moment. So I don't know how you conclude that life requires a supernatural life giver.
In the material world, we have come to understand that there is a law of biology called the law of biogenesis.
Another law that you're going to throw at us without showing where you got it from. And again, I'm not saying that these laws don't exist or are false. I'm saying you're not giving someone who's new to the concept a very good reason to believe you. You're just throwing out things, calling them laws, and moving on.
Law of biogenesis simply says this, that in this material, natural world, life comes from previously existing life of its own kind.
Kind, kind, kind. I can't stop focusing on the word kind. Kind meaning what? That seems like such a vague term that wouldn't actually be in any scientific theory, but what does it mean? Previously existing life of its own kind. Do you think that God is of our own kind, or does he just get a pass because he's supernatural, so that means he can break whatever rules he wants to? How convenient.
Now, when we look at how people used to think about life, they said, no, life can arise spontaneously from non-living chemicals.
Why can't it? It's like, okay, why can't it?
And yet every single biological experiment has shown.
Every single biological experiment, every single one, all of them in the history of existence ever. How many citations did you have to cobble up before you could confidently say that? Or did you just not bother getting any? Because you're not sharing any with us. You're just showing us random things on the screen rather than actually showing us these alleged experiments. But okay, I'm just supposed to believe you, random person dude, about all. I'm just supposed to believe what you say about all experiments throughout the course of history ever. But okay.
Us that simply is biologically impossible.
Why? You keep saying it's impossible, but you don't explain why it's impossible.
Life doesn't arise from non-living chemicals.
Okay, I believe you. But not really.
From where did life arise?
It could have arose from those non-living chemicals, but you just sort of said that's not the right answer without explaining why or how you know that. You're just like, no. And we're just supposed to believe you.
Where did life originate if it doesn't arise from non-living chemicals?
Which you haven't proven or demonstrated. That's just a thing you said in a video, but okay.
You see, the idea that there's no God suggests to us that there had to be some singularity without a cause.
No, it doesn't. It's like, no, it doesn't. Just because God isn't the cause doesn't mean that there is no cause. God isn't the cause of you directly, yet you have other causes. So I don't even understand this line of reasoning.
That exploded, and that explosion
Again, it wasn't an explosion, but okay.
brought about design, which we've never, ever seen happen. And
again, design is being vaguely used and poorly defined, but okay.
then ultimately, somewhere the non-living chemicals gave rise to life, but that's biologically impossible.
You keep saying that without actually proving or demonstrating that and expecting someone who doesn't already believe you to just believe you because you say it's impossible. You haven't given any demonstration, any examples, any proof, any evidence, any citations, nothing. You're just saying it couldn't happen.
Life demands a supernatural creator.
But when you just straight up say that it can't have a natural cause, then of course you can just make that leap in logic.
Proof number 4.
Wait, that was supposed to be a proof? That wasn't a proof of anything. You just said a bunch of stuff. You didn't even bother to substantiate. This is worse than the last one, where at least you tried sort of kind of to explain your line of reasoning and how you got to where you got to. This one, you kind of just said over and over again, it couldn't have come from non-living chemicals, and then said, therefore, supernatural creator, which necessarily must mean God, because there's no other kind of supernatural creator, and you know this somehow.
Moral law demands a moral law giver.
Ah, I hate this one too. It's so stupid.
If some things are objectively morally right and other things are objectively morally wrong, then there must be a God.
No, there must not, because humans can make up morally right and wrong things. Also, how do you know if something is objectively morally right or wrong? What does it mean to say that something is objectively morally right or wrong? This is functionally equivalent to saying that something is better than something else objectively, and not saying better at performing a specific task, which could be demonstrated, but you're saying just better. Batman is just better than Superman. And when I ask you what that means, you're just, oh, you're better. You're just better. And it's like, how do you test that in an objective sense? Same thing with morally right and wrong. What do you mean when you say something is objectively morally right? Now, you might say it is objectively the thing that we ought to do, but what does it mean for something to be something we ought to do? What does the ought and the should mean? What do you mean when you say objectively you should do this thing? I don't know what that means to say objectively I should do something. Now, if I wanted a specific goal, I can see why that would I could see why you telling me this is the most effective means of accomplishing that goal, that would be a good understanding of should, but that would be subjective and that would be depending on the goal. So, since that's not what you're saying, I don't know what you are saying.
You see, if we evolved from primordial slime over multiplied millions of years, at what point did objective moral values arise?
They didn't, or at least not as far as I can tell. I'm not convinced that objective moral values arose in the first place. So this question presumes something I'm not willing to grant.
We don't look at a dog and say that that dog objectively, morally violated some rule when he steals a bone from another dog. We don't
Some people might say that. Just because you don't say it doesn't mean that's not something that people say.
say, hey,
Lots of people, when a dog snatches something off the counter that he's not supposed to take, will be very upset and be very angry at the dog and chase the dog away and be like, the dog shouldn't have taken my things.
he violated a objective moral value. We just don't say that.
Again, you don't say that, but I'm not convinced that that means nobody else does. And follow me with this one, perhaps we don't say that because there is no objective moral value. Perhaps. Maybe.
But we do say that humans can perpetrate things that are objectively morally wrong, that humans can be involved in things that are morally right.
Who is this we? Because some people say that and some people don't. And even when they do say that, you're not explaining what that means. When you say someone engages with things that are objectively morally right, what are you saying? What are they doing? Ob- Objectively.
If that's true, there must be a God.
Why?
Proof number 5, free will.
Whoa. We did not even make the connection to God. You made by far the weakest argument in favor of objective morality that I've ever seen. Just the worst. Just people don't say it, therefore the opposite is true. If we say it, it must objectively be true. That's the basis of your argument. And then you said, therefore God, and moved along. You did not even bother to connect the objective moral law to the objective moral lawgiver. I was really expecting this to go, well, if we have an objective moral law, laws don't arise on their own, therefore there must be an objective moral lawgiver. At least that would have been as bad as the other arguments. But this one is somehow worse because you literally went, therefore God, and walked off. You did not make any connection to God whatsoever, never mind the definition of God. You just literally said, therefore God, and moved on. Okay, I don't know how many more of these proofs I can handle, but let's keep going.
The atheistic idea that there is no God is founded on the idea of materialism.
No, it isn't. there can be and are conceptions of atheists or atheism that are still very much spiritual in nature and do not necessarily believe in materialism. For example, you could be into something like Wiccanism that doesn't necessarily posit a deity, but very much has spiritual aspects. Heck, astrology is a really good example of something that doesn't necessarily apply to some sort of deity specifically, yet at the same time very much applies to some sort of otherworldly, spiritual, universal aspect. So I see no reason why these things are explicitly tied as you said they are. Not to say that there are not a lot of atheists that have their atheism founded on materialism, but to say that it's not as black and white as you're making it seem.
The idea that this material world is all that there is, all that there was, and all that there ever will be.
That is not what materialism is. Immaterialism does not say that the immaterial is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. So then why would materialism say that? Materialism, and at its basic sense, is generally understood to be there is material stuff. Just like immaterialism is generally understood to be there is immaterial stuff. And then you have hard materialists, weak materialists, just like you have hard immaterialists and weak immaterialists. I personally would consider myself more on the weak materialist spectrum in that the universe is all that I know of, not all that there is, because if I knew all that there was, that would be a whole omniscient paradox thing going on. But I say all of that who blah blah to say that I don't think you have a very good understanding of a lot of materialist positions. And I would go as far as to say that this is almost misrepresentative. I can't really think of any materialist that would go that far necessarily with a great degree of certainty. Not to say that they're not out there, just to say I'm not aware of them.
Because of that, atheism has to suggest that you as a person don't really have free will.
No, not necessarily. There are a lot of people that try to make arguments from free will from materialism. I don't necessarily agree with those arguments, and I still don't necessarily understand what free will is even supposed to be, but they do have those positions. So it's not fair to say that atheism has to suggest there is no free will when there are atheists that believe there is free will.
That there is no being inside of your body or brain.
How? Okay, but follow me on this one. What if I think the being is the body and the brain and the composition of those things? What if I don't make a distinction between the body and the brain and the self and just say that they're all one and the same?
That is super matter.
Super matter? What's that? Do you see my problem? Does anyone who's going to be watching this probably a week after this comes out, does anyone actually see the problem that I'm having here? He just says things without explaining what they are, where he got them from, just says super matter, whatever that's supposed to be, and expects that we know what that means.
That really what's going on in your brain is just electrons bouncing around, and you're the product of those bounces, and you don't really make decisions on your own. It's just the physical laws and properties going on in your brain.
You are the physical laws and properties going on in your brain. So when they make decisions, that is the same thing as you making decisions. However, I don't need to go that far to make my point. Any decision you make is in a larger or even smaller context for which you have no control over. If your mental capacity is very limited and you have some sort of learning disability, the decisions you make are inevitably hindered and determined by that. Someone with a learning disability cannot make the same decisions as someone without that learning disability. Now, that person with a learning disability might learn how to live with it, might learn how to curve with it, but there are certain concepts that they simply can't grasp. And that's not their choice. They don't choose that biology, they're just under its control. So explain to me how one's will is free if there are biological factors like your mental capacity over which you have no control that inevitably deterministically affect the decisions you make? Or do you think you can just choose to refuse and ignore your biology and just make whatever decisions for no reason?
If you are watching this video of your own volition, then the fact of the matter is there has to be a God that
We've already been over this. I already made a video on this. I don't want to go through this again. Why are you making me go through this again? Why? You already made a video on this stupid point.
can account for that free will that you as a person have.
And that must be God, because why?
There has to be a God if there is free will.
Why? You don't explain why. You just say that. You just say that. You just say, well, if atheism's true, then there's no free will and we're not really making decisions. And I'm like, okay, and you're like, but we are really making decisions, and you're not going to substantiate or prove that we're really making decisions. You're just going to say that and then say, therefore God. This is therefore God, the video. That's it. If I was doing a video on this, I would have just titled it therefore God.
And proof number 6.
Told you, didn't even explain it. Just went on to the next point. I'm telling you, I'm psychic at these things.
Reasoning. You see, we reason on a regular basis.
Some of us do, but as evidenced by the existence of your video, some of us clearly do not.
We understand abstract ideas.
Some of us do, but some of us don't. What accounts for that?
If we were products of blind, chance, random processes over multiplied millions of years.
But we're not. As far as I best understand, we're the product of evolutionary processes where our evolution depends on how well suited we are for specific environments, and whatever traits survive are passed on. I see no reason that is random. And no, this is not in the commonly understood morally bad way, but survival of the fittest is not blind, chance, or random in any sense that I can discern. But let's say, for the sake of argument going forward, that all of this is true, even though I don't necessarily agree with it. Let's go with it.
Reasoning and the laws of reasoning.
Laws of reasoning? What are the laws of reasoning? And where did you get these laws from? Do you see the point that I was talking about before, when he just throws out laws and doesn't say where he gets it from? He just throws out something, says it's a law, and moves on.
Simply would have no explanation. And yet we reason together on a regular basis.
Except for all of us that don't. Have you genuinely never met a human being incapable of reasoning? Have you never had a conflict with someone else where your reasonings were so vastly different that you couldn't come to a mutual meeting ground? Have you never met anyone with any sort of learning disability, and thus they have exceeding difficulty reasoning in the same way that you do? Are you really just not paying attention to all the people that can't and contradict your point? Or do you genuinely think that absolutely everyone, regardless of those factors, is doing human reasoning? Because at that point, what even is human reasoning?
From where does reason arise?
I don't know, actually. At least not off the top of my head on a live stream. I don't know. I probably could come up with a better answer over time, but I don't know.
It's got no naturalistic, atheistic explanation.
Why would you suggest that? I can think of one off the top of my head. Whether or not it's accurate or not is not the point. It's a possible explanation. The possible explanation could be that reason was advantageous for us to survive. We had to be able to reason as to what was dangerous and what was not dangerous, for what we ought to do to live and what we ought not to do to live. That reasoning process alone can get us to where we are. So why couldn't that be a naturalistic atheist explanation? I'm not saying that it is or that it's the only one, but couldn't it be?
Anthony Flew, an atheist who wrote Theology and Falsification, the most popular atheistic paper for the last 100 years, the last century.
You're going to have to demonstrate that one as well. You can say that it was the most popular, but that doesn't mean that it is. And I'm glad you actually, for once in the video, actually referred to a specific person saying a specific thing. Now, if you can just demonstrate why the things he said was accurate, we might actually get somewhere. Otherwise, you're just going to show me, hey, here's a random atheist dude that said a thing. Therefore, I'm right.
In 2006, he co-wrote a book titled There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Became a Believer.
Do you know how self-righteous it comes across to declare yourself as the world's most notorious atheist? To declare anyone the world's most notorious atheist is a stretch, but to declare oneself specifically is a very, very, very large stretch. It's a very hard pill to swallow, but okay. And also, just because you changed your mind doesn't mean that you were right. So why do I care that a person changed their mind?
He stated that his rule of life had always been to follow the evidence where it leads.
Okay, what evidence led him to God, and why are we talking about him instead of talking about that?
And he said he followed that evidence, and it led him to the conclusion that there is a supernatural, intelligent God.
Okay, we still don't know what a God is, so that doesn't do us a whole bunch of good, but we'll see.
Let's let the evidence lead us to that same conclusion.
Wait, that was the proof? Atheist dude said so? You didn't even explain what made him change his mind or how he came to the conclusion that he got to. You literally just had as your proof of God's existence, hey, look, Anthony Flew, atheist guy, wrote a book, changed his mind, therefore God. I cannot with this video. I cannot. This turned out to be way more stressful than I actually intended it to be. And I knew it was going to be stressful and I knew it was going to be cumbersome, but I had never in my wildest dreams imagined that it was going to be this bad. I am dejected to have wasted my time actually watching that video. I refuse. We're going to go on to the next one because this was not the boss rush that I thought it was going to be. So next up on the menu, we shall be going to a more specific question of why doesn't God show himself? The answer of which seems abundantly obvious to me is that he just doesn't want to. But apparently this is a question that boggles people and they struggle with when the answer seems abundantly obvious. If God possesses the ability to show himself, the only reason why he wouldn't is because he does not want to. He chose not to because he doesn't want to. There's nothing necessitating that he doesn't. So then it has to be his wants. Or at least that's the only other thing that I personally can think of. But rambling enough, let's get to the video. Why doesn't God just show himself?
Why God doesn't just appear to everyone on earth and prove in person that he exists.
Now, I wouldn't necessarily think that would prove his existence, but it would be a heck of a lot better than what we've got now. Meeting someone in person is much more convincing than never meeting them at all.
Why doesn't he show himself to each generation of humanity so that everyone on earth can see and hear him and know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is real?
Well, he doesn't have to even go that far as to constantly reappear every generation. All he would have to do is appear like other historical figures that we can verify. If he appeared now to everyone on earth, he wouldn't need to come back in a couple decades or centuries or anything like that, because we would have documented good, well-written evidence of his existence, given that he's physically here, and people would try to verify that he was the actual God. And if he actually did survive that verification test, that test would stand the test of time. The reason we don't necessarily, the point I'm making is we don't doubt we don't doubt the existence of historical figures, and they don't need to reappear every now and then for us to conclude that, hey, they existed. We don't need people who have recently passed away to come back a year from now to prove that they existed in the first place. So why would it be any different with God? Also, that jumbled mess you just heard me speak is exactly why I do a lot of heavy editing in my videos. So enjoy the bloopers.
After all, according to the Bible, the Lord appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, and he spoke to Moses face to face.
Yeah, that was back when he sort of kind of cared, whereas now he just doesn't, I guess.
As a man speaks to his friend. So why doesn't he do this?
He did not speak to them as a man speaks to his friend. He gave very clear orders and commandments and was very, very bossy. None of that indicates that he is speaking to them as a friend. But okay, that's a nitpick.
Same for everyone else. Christians freely admit that there are many specific things that we don't know about the eternal, omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe.
Do you admit that you don't know any of those things you just said about God are actually true of God? Or that you have a definition of God that's coherent and not contradictory? Because if we're going to start with things that you don't know, I'm much more skeptical of that description of God than I am of this specific question. But I'll try to stay on topic.
Including
Also, if this is an admission that you don't know, why does the video continue on past the point? It should literally be, we don't know, and that should be the end of the video, but you go on for some reason.
Why he does or does not do certain things.
Okay, so the video is continuing because
there's no way to know the mind of God unless he chooses to reveal some of his ways to us.
Even that is not really a way of knowing the mind of God. Someone telling you something does not give you a way to know what they're thinking, because they could be lying. They could be under a falsehood themselves. They could be delusional. There are lots of different things. Revealing something to you is not necessarily an effective way to give you insight into the person, because people can be manipulative liars. And I see no reason why God couldn't be a manipulative liar. I see no reason to hinge on his revelations to us as a way of knowing why he does or doesn't do the things that he does or doesn't do.
So has God specifically revealed why he hasn't appeared to every human being in the history of the world to prove his existence to them?
As I stated, it doesn't necessarily have to be to every human in the existence of the world. There are people that we know now exist, and as we live and breathe, despite the fact that they have not appeared to every single person. So that level of proof isn't necessary or even warranted. But even more so, it's not a matter of why hasn't he, it's why doesn't he. If he did so now, then we would probably ask why he waited so long. But considering the fact that he still has yet to do that, the question is, why isn't he doing it now?
The fact is, God doesn't expressly address this question in the Bible.
So again, you don't know. End of video, right?
But he does reveal enough to us about himself and his creation to know a few things.
Are these things answers to the questions that we're asking? Because I get the distinct impression that they're not, based on what you just said.
Beginning with the fact that even if God did directly appear to and speak with every person on earth, not everyone would believe in him.
Yes, but that's not the point. Even if God sacrificed his son in a bloody, brutal blood sacrifice, that wouldn't make everyone believe in him, but he still did it. The fact, it's like, even if God appeared on earth, not everyone would believe in him is not a valid point of why he doesn't show up. Because he also, orchestrated the brutal murder of his own son for the sake of the world, when it was not at all necessary, because he's all omnipotent, as you said, and could just solve the problem without the blood sacrifice. It doesn't make sense. If the method that God has currently chosen to use, which is the Bible and the blood sacrifice of his own child, if that method has not guaranteed that everyone on earth would believe in him, why is that method preferable to this other method that doesn't have blood sacrifice, but also wouldn't get everyone on earth to believe in him?
After all, God revealed himself to mankind in the first century as Jesus of Nazareth.
That is not revealing yourself. Revealing yourself under an alias and a different name and a different form is not revealing yourself. This is the functional equivalent of me trying to do a face reveal using someone else's body and someone else's face and someone else's voice, but still giving a face reveal and saying, this is who I really am, when that is in fact not who I really am. So I don't think it counts. You just said earlier in the video that God appeared to specific people, but he didn't do it as Jesus. So then why are you trying to equate him actually appearing to him appearing as this other person that he is apparently not, but also is, and also is this third thing called the Holy Spirit, but we'll get to the Trinity later.
Speaking like no man ever spoke and working all manner.
Speaking like no man ever spoke? Have you read the Bible? Have you really never ever heard anyone speak like Jesus? Because I don't think you're very educated if that's the case. I don't see what is so remarkable or special about Jesus' speech that would lead you to say that.
Of miracles, including walking on water.
You say miracles, but these miracles, even if they happened as allegedly reported, are functionally indistinct from magic tricks. No one that I have encountered thus far, and especially not the Bible on its own, has been able to give me any explanation for how these miracles occurred. Not just a sufficient one. I've never heard any explanation as to how Jesus walks on water. He just does. And people just believe that with no understanding of how that works at all. He just did it without any skepticism at all. If you don't understand how something happened, how can you conclude that it did in fact happen? If you don't know the processes at all, are you not making an assumption? Are you not jumping to conclusions? Because again, that's what happens with magic tricks. People can make you think they did something that they did not in fact do because you do not understand how they did the thing that they told you they did. If you understood how and you understood the magic trick, you would understand that they didn't do the thing. So rambling over, but it's important to know how things happened and not to say Jesus did miracles. And then when someone asks how, you go, I don't know, but he did.
Healing the blind and reattaching severed body parts with the touch of his hand.
Also, that is kind of a dick thing for Jesus to do. Let me explain. Because he healed some of the blind, but he didn't heal all the blind people. He reattached some of the severed limbs, but he didn't reattach them all. Mind you, I'm working under the presumption that everything this guy says is true. He was very, very selective about who he helped and who he didn't, when he could have helped everyone at the same time, which would have been a much better demonstration of power and kindness and loving than just going, hey, you, random blind, I'm going to heal you. What about the random blind guy down the street? Don't worry about him. He'll be all right. I'm just going to heal you, and then I'll reattach your severed limbs, and then I'll feed you, and everybody else will be fine. They can just fend for themselves. I'm trying to show off, so I'm not going to help everybody. I'm just going to help certain people to demonstrate my point that I could help people. I mean, I'm not going to help people, but this is just to show I could help people. Again, operating under everything this guy says is true.
Even though Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and came back from the dead himself, many still did not believe in him.
Again, allegedly, but those are feats of necromancy. And explain to me how necromancy equates to omnipotence. Because last time I checked, it doesn't. Just because you can raise someone else from the dead or raise yourself from the dead doesn't automatically make you the creator God of the universe. Consider this. As far as the Bible is concerned, Satan possesses a degree of magical power, whatever that means. So Satan also can do magic tricks. So how do I know if Satan is doing magic tricks to deceive me or if Jesus is the risen Lord and Savior of the universe? If they both are magic tricks and I don't understand how they work, how can I tell them apart?
They rejected him despite the fact that he, God, appeared to them face to face.
Yes. Are you going to mention why they rejected him, or are you just going to skip past that part as if that's not important to you? Again, you are operating under the assumption that he is God, and upon meeting him for the first time, that's not something they're going to operate under. And doing magic tricks and raising someone from the dead is not enough to substantiate that point.
Sadly, not only would many continue in their unbelief if God actually did appear to them, Many more would reject his authority over them, even if they acknowledge his existence.
So Satan does the same thing, and God doesn't seem to be too bothered by that.
Judas was among the closest friends and disciples of Jesus, yet he was a thief who eventually betrayed the Lord. One might argue that Judas never believed, which would only further validate our first point.
How would it validate your first point when your first point is contingent upon, well, nobody would believe him if he appeared in person. That's why he just murdered his son in front of everyone. Sure, and that also didn't convince everyone, but hey, that's better. It's better to murder your own son than to just appear in front of people, even if it produces the same result, which I'm not convinced it would, by the way.
But if he truly believed in Jesus as the Son of God, then he ultimately chose money over the master.
Okay, here's a problem with this master thing. Who decided that Jesus was the master other than himself? Because if we're going to go by that logic, then Satan can just declare himself the master. And then how am I supposed to know who the real master is? I could just declare myself the master. Declaring oneself the master, regardless of degree of power, does not, in fact, make you a master. He chose money over that dude. You can call that dude your master, but that wasn't his master. And I don't like this weird fetishization of Jesus being a master. Like, oh, this slave betrayed his master, because that's the only context in which I can understand Jesus being a master is if we are slaves. Other than that, what does it mean for us to have masters but also not be slaves? Or are you saying slavery to Jesus is a good thing?
He chose sin over the Savior.
So what? Isn't that the entire point of the free will thing that the other guy of the same video of the same channel was complaining about? That's a choice he's allowed to make. So what? You're like, I don't understand the point in you bringing this up.
He was not and will not be the last to make such choices.
Okay, so this has nothing to do with the discussion we're making, because regardless of whether or regardless of whether God shows up in person, these things are going to continue happening. So why doesn't God show up? If these things are going to happen regardless, then this isn't a point against why God hasn't shown up yet.
Make no mistake about it. In no way does acknowledging God's existence directly translate into loving him and submitting to his will.
Which are things that I'm not convinced you should do anyway. I acknowledge that, but I'm not convinced that those are things that you should do. The only people that are convinced that those are things that you should do are the people doing them. So why should we love him and submit to his will? Also, murdering your son does not translate into getting the human race to love you and submit to your will, but he still did that, didn't he?
In fact, in his debate with my colleague Kyle Budd a few years ago, atheist Dan Barker demonstrated such rebelliousness.
You call it rebelliousness, but not going along with something isn't necessarily rebellious. If I just say I'm your master and claim dominion over you and demand that you submit and love me, and you don't, are you being rebellious? Or are you being reasonable because a random guy just came up and made an unreasonable demand of you? And whether that guy is a guy or that guy is a god, that doesn't change how reasonable or unreasonable the being is being.
You're telling me that the God you love and admire has consigned us to eternal torture? And I would say to that God, if you created hell, you go to hell. If you want to torture me forever, fine. You prove what a big macho man you are. You do not have my respect.
Now, are you going to actually acknowledge why he was being rebellious? Are you going to acknowledge the points that he was making? Are you going to comment on that at all? Or was your only take from that is he don't want to follow God? You didn't hear why, you didn't hear his reasoning, you didn't hear his moral objections, you didn't hear anything but he don't want to follow God. And I don't know how you just ignored the point he was trying to get across and just took the end part of he don't want to be with God.
It seems many people wouldn't believe in God even if he did appear to them.
They also wouldn't believe even if he murdered his son, but that didn't stop him now, did it?
Many others might come to believe that he exists, yet they would still reject his authority over them.
Because because claiming authority does not automatically give you authority, and merely existing is not good enough to be loved and have people bend to your will. So I see no valid reason why either of those things are problems. But even if they were, these problems would exist without the son bloodshed. So why did we go with the son bloodshed?
And choose sin over the Savior. Finally, consider that God has already given every accountable person on earth an adequate amount of evidence to come to a knowledge of his existence.
Please don't do what I think you're going to do. Please don't. Please don't. Because I think I know what you're going to do. And I think I know which part of the Bible you're going to go to, and it scares me. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. Just end the video now and save us all the pain. Please. Please.
The very reality of a material universe testifies to the existence of a creator.
How? The existence of this creator would still be true even without the material universe. So the material universe is by no means necessary to the existence of the gods. So how?
For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God.
I don't know what to do. I genuinely, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. I do not know what I'm supposed to do with this. I do not know how he got this as evidence for God's existence. Someone or something in Hebrews said this, therefore God exists. Therefore, everyone has been given sufficient evidence that God exists. There's no explanation. There's no context for where we are in Hebrews, what's going on, who is saying this, are they actually an authority? Just here you go. Random verse with no context. Therefore, be a Christian.
According to Romans 1 and verse 20, since the time of Adam and Eve, mankind has been given the opportunity to see how the things that are made testify quite clearly on behalf of a powerful, invisible creator.
Do you not see the contradiction? Do you genuinely not? Do we need lens crafters? Do we need to get the commercial with the owl and the glasses in here? Because I really think we do. If you can't see the contradiction that obvious. For the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. If something is clearly seen, how is it invisible? And if it's invisible, how can it be clearly seen? These terms appear to be obviously contradictory to another. Now, you might say that the terms invisible and clearly seen are meant differently, but then you have to define that and explain that, and you can't just throw out a random verse with no context and not showing who said this. Why should we believe whoever said this in Romans during whatever time, whatever was happening? And then to say that being understood by things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, says that person. Though none of that makes sense in and of itself. Or if it does, you failed to explain it. So I don't know how people are without excuse when Godhead has not been defined, eternal power has not been defined, invisible attributes hasn't been defined, clearly seeing invisible attributes hasn't even begun to be explained. There's so much wrong with this one verse by itself. And this verse is taken out of context, or at least it's not presented in the proper context. We don't know who said this. We don't know the context of Romans at this point in the Bible. We're just given random verse from random person saying here, therefore you're without excuse because this part in the book says you're without excuse. Okay, I guess.
As the psalmist said, the heavens declare the glory of God.
The heavens being what? Because the heavens can mean various different things depending on who you talk to, because some people mean actual heaven and some people mean just the sky or just the stars, which again, if you want to say that they declare the glory of God, that's fine, but declaring the glory of something doesn't declare its existence. Those are two different things. And to say that the firmament shows his handiwork, the hell is a firmament?
And the firmament
And yes, I know one can look up what a firmament is. One can look up what the firmament means in the Bible. However, I'm responding to him and I'm responding to the points that he is making. And if he is not going to bother to present the definitions for his terms, I'm not going to go out of my way to do that right now. Of course, I will in my spare time, but I doubt the 8 people watching this 2 weeks after this comes out are going to want to listen to me, do that long research.
It shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge.
Says random parts in Psalm from random person or thing in Psalm out of context.
There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world.
Okay, so let's break this down. A baby is born. It's like a baby is born. And as soon as they are born, they suffer from a terrible disease that kills them. Does this apply to the baby? Because I don't think it does. And I don't think any of this nonsense applies to individuals that lack the capacity to understand such things. I don't think this applies to individuals that are in social or socioeconomic situations where they can't think about the heavens or the firmament or any of this nonsense because they have to pay bills and survive. I am not convinced that this applies to the vast majority of people, as if people constantly study the heavens and study the firmament and study speech and language. And that's not even getting into the people who simply just lack the mental capacity to comprehend complex subjects like the heavens. But do go on.
So why doesn't God appear to every person on earth to prove that he exists? The short answer is because he, as the sovereign ruler of the universe, chooses not to.
Because he who said he's the sovereign ruler of the universe chose not to. Just because you acknowledge that doesn't mean anybody else is under any obligation to acknowledge that. And as much as you continue to glorify God in your speech, I am under no obligation to do so, and I see no valid reason to do so, so I'm just going to ignore it. I am not going to, even for argument's sake, concede God's authority for no reason. And yeah, because he chose not to is the simple answer, but it's not the larger answer. Because if you say because he chose not to, then you have to ask why.
We may not know all of God's reasons for why he chooses not to appear personally to every human being on the earth throughout every generation.
Which is not the point of the question, but okay.
But in no way does such a decision on his part prove that he doesn't exist.
This is correct. Not choosing to reveal yourself does not mean you don't exist. However, it also doesn't mean you do exist, and it does not give people good reasons to believe you exist. If you go out of your way to hide from people and not reveal yourself, or not even out of your way, you just choose not to, that is the opposite of giving them a good reason to think that you exist. That is not contributing to the alleged goal that you are striving towards. How is choosing to not reveal oneself contributing to the goal of as many people as possible knowing and loving and worshiping you?
Or that he's unkind and unfair?
Yeah, it kind of does. If you're going to judge me based on whether or not I believe you exist and then you hide from me, are you not making my job more difficult? Are you not making my free will decision that much more difficult to make? Again, if people are going to make the decisions they want to make anyway, then this doesn't affect that. So this would actually possibly be helpful. I don't understand how you can say that someone is fair to judge you for not knowing they exist, but they also just don't show up ever. Why didn't you ever call me? I didn't know you existed. That's no excuse, apparently.
The fact is, God has always given man adequate evidence for his existence.
Adequate evidence meaning what? It might be adequate evidence to you, but clearly others disagree. It's very nice for you to just say that, but that's a point that you actually have to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate that the evidence is sufficient, that it is adequate, and that people are rejecting it in spite of knowing its adequacy.
So much so that any person who refuses to acknowledge his existence is without excuse.
Says random part in the Bible. and you believe random part in the Bible. Either you have a larger context that verifies the validity of the verse in the Bible you showed, or and you're just deliberately hiding that from us, or you quite literally don't know and don't have the context of that verse. You just looked at the verse and believed it. You either have a greater context that you aren't sharing with the rest of the class, or you don't, and you just believe random verses in the Bible outside of their context.
If you would like to learn more about the evidence for the existence of God, be sure to visit apologeticpress.org.
Nope, I will not let you plug your stuff on my channel. Absolutely not. We are going to our last how does one say, speed round. One moment. We're going to our speed round, and we are going to the last video, which is, believe it or not, by far even worse, but you'll see when we get there.
So I've got a question that's always bothered me. The Bible says there's one God, but in other parts of the Bible, God is three: Father, Son, and Spirit. How can it be both?
Yeah.
It can't, because 1 does not equal 3. Problem solved. But for some reason, this video will continue to go on. Let me check chat for a second. Of course, no one's still here. Just had to check. And we're back to the video.
This is a question that has mystified people for thousands of years. And
It really shouldn't, because it's effectively just telling people 1 equals 3, which is just not true. So what's to be mystified about? I guess if you're trying to make that make sense, then you'd be mystified. But trying to make sense out of nonsense isn't a good thing and is not something you should be doing, in my opinion.
while we can't fully explain it,
But you're about to. You say you can't fully explain it in a video where you are proceeding to try to explain it.
think we can better understand what it is that we can't fully understand.
How? How is it that you can better understand the thing that you cannot better understand, or the thing that you cannot fully understand? Also, how do you know your limitations of understanding? How do you know that you can't understand it now, as opposed to you can't understand it ever?
What do you mean?
Well, think of it this way. Here's a two-dimensional plane. And then here's an object with 3 dimensions that's going to pass through the 2D plane.
It's important to note for this example, which is not really very effective, because you're still not giving a definition of what God is supposed to be. So I can't check if this definition applies to what God actually is, because you still haven't defined God. You're just going to skip what a God even is. But it's important to note that we do not exist on a 2-dimensional plane. So this doesn't make sense. Your analogy is flawed simply because it just straight up doesn't apply. And if you want to apply that to higher dimensions, you will have to explain those higher dimensions first, not start with the lower dimensions.
Okay, right. From this perspective, the 3D objects above and below the plane.
So now it makes sense. But imagine you were a 2D person
How can I imagine I'm a 2D person?
stuck on the 2D plane. What would you say?
I don't know. What would I see?
Well, it would look like this.
Oh, yeah, okay. From this perspective, it looks impossible. It's 1 object, and then 2 objects, and then 3.
What? What is happening? What is happening right now?
But in reality, they're all 1, just not in the way you're capable of understanding.
How is that not in a way that I'm capable of understanding? If it's not in a way that I'm capable of understanding, then I can't understand what you just said, and you can't understand what you just said, which kind of invalidates the validity of everything in this video. But furthermore, I think that's an extremely poor example, because at the end of the day, that thing is still only 1 thing and is not 3 things. It's only you seeing 3 different sides of it. So if you want to say God is cosplaying and transforming into different things as he's switching from his God attire to his Jesus attire to his Holy Spirit attire and rotating between the 3, that's fine. That is internally consistent. That is 1 thing that presents itself in 3 different ways. However, most people distinctly make the claim that Jesus is God's son, and in that regard is not God, and that the Holy Spirit is a distinct separate entity. The contradiction and the confusion and the problem, go away, anti-sleeper, we'll talk later. The contradiction and the problem with all of those things is that you are saying that it is 3 and 1 at the same time. However, the example you just demonstrated is that it's one thing that is just seen in three different ways. And if you want to say God is one thing that cosplays as three different things, that's fine. If you want to say that God changes forms, that's fine. But if you want to say that God is these three things and also not these three things, then we have a problem. So if we accept the analogy you presented, Jesus is not the Son of God. He is God and is not God's Son, which undermines a large point of the Bible, giving his only begotten Son and all that. But that's not a point that I think you're willing to concede, so therein lies the problem.
Now, let's take this whole thing as a visual analogy for how we experience God.
Are you going to explain what God is? Because I think that would be really helpful, especially right about now.
The claim in the Bible is that God is transcendent,
Meaning?
a divine being through whom we live.
How do you live through a being? What does it mean to be divine? Do you see the problem with throwing out random terms and not explaining them to people who don't enter the video agreeing with you?
And move and have our being. Or, as God says, I am.
So, what does that mean just to say you are, or to say I am? Am I not? Are you not? If God says I am, what does that mean? We all are. So how does that distinguish God from anyone and anything else?
Okay, but I live here in this universe, so when God appears, it will make sense in some ways, but in other ways, it will break my categories.
God could circumvent all of this by simply giving you better knowledge and giving you more categories, but instead he's deliberately not giving you more information and not giving you more categories to make this process easier. But we're just not going to talk about that, I guess.
Exactly. This happens all the time when people encounter the God of the Bible. So let's look first at how this happens in the Hebrew Scriptures. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, God appears in complicated ways that don't quite fit our categories.
Why would God deliberately choose to appear in ways that don't fit our current categories? Why would he choose to appear in ways that he knows we are less likely to understand? Kind of seems counterintuitive to the entire goal, don't you think?
One common way this happens is with God's attributes.
So an attribute
Alleged attributes.
is a way to describe what something is like.
Kind of. You could use that. I guess that's a passable definition, as long as you know that the attribute is not the thing itself. So when I ask you what something is and you give me an attribute, you are not telling me what the thing is. You are telling me the attributes it possesses, what it is similar to, but not what it actually is itself.
For example, a soccer ball is round, right? Or God is wise.
Yes, but here's the difference. Round is physically testable and generally understood. Wise is not. Wise is very much debated, and different people have different definitions and understandings and qualifications that they would say make someone wise. For example, there are individuals that would say certain presidents are wise and other presidents are not. That disagreement in and of itself points out a fundamental problem with using the word wise to describe God, because God is wise to you. But to say that that's an attribute he possesses in the same way that round is an attribute that a ball possesses is something you have to demonstrate. And I can demonstrate to you that a ball is round by defining what round is, what a ball is, and how a ball fits with that definition and description of round. Can you do the same thing with God?
Yeah, great. Let's take God's wisdom. So the book of Proverbs says that God created the world by his wisdom.
And we know Proverbs wasn't lying or wrong because reasons. Also, what does it mean to create the world by his wisdom? This implies that you can create the world not by your wisdom or something? Do you see how this doesn't really make sense? Or better yet, how did he create the world? Because by your wisdom isn't really an explanation of how he created the universe. So how did he create the universe? Especially with what wisdom? At that particular non-point in time, because time hadn't been created yet, but puts that to the side for a second, take it in your brain, throw it over there. So At this particular non-point in time, nothing existed besides God. So there was nothing else to know besides God. So God's wisdom of himself and nothing else is what he used to create the universe. Or he just saw into the future, in which case he didn't create anything by his wisdom. He just did what he knew he was already going to do and didn't really have a choice in because his knowledge is absolute. Do you see how these concepts are confusing and how we lose the plot a little bit when you say God created things by his wisdom at a time where there was nothing else besides God, so there was nothing to be wise about? But let's go on. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. We're almost there. We've almost made it. This is the final boss.
But then there are also poems in the book of Proverbs that describe God's wisdom as a person.
Meaning what?
A co-worker through whom God architected the universe.
So wisdom doesn't actually mean wisdom. It just means another person. And if it means another person, we run into the problem that I was talking about before. Is this other person God? If it is, God's just talking to himself and acting like he's more than one person. If this is a separate person, then they are not God. It's really that simple. And I do not understand how it is not that simple to anyone else.
So God's attribute becomes a separate character.
How? How does your attribute become a separate literal entity? How?
Yeah, this also happens with God's glory, which sometimes appears as a human figure on a throne that's engulfed in fire.
How? It sounds like you're just describing different things with names that don't fit, because the description you give doesn't sound like it has anything to do with glory. It's just a thing that you call glory. And you can call it glory all you like, but that doesn't mean that's what it is. And if it is glory, then it is still not God. Regardless of whether it's God's wisdom or God's glory, God's wisdom is not God. God's glory is not God. So we are still at one God, which is still contradictory to the point that there are three distinct, separate one gods.
Or take God's word, which he can speak to people, but sometimes his word appears like a person.
Am I going to have to ask how this whole video? Because I feel like I'm going to have to ask how this whole video, because you're not going to explain how. You're just going to say these are things that happen without describing the mechanism or the process by which these happen. God says stuff, and him saying stuff, the concept of him saying stuff becomes its own person that appears to people, I guess.
Wait, so God's attributes have become new little gods?
If they're God's attributes, no, they're not separate entities. But if you're going to say they're separate entities...
No, the biblical authors believe there's only one all-powerful God.
Yes, there's only one all-powerful God, but there are also these three things that are either God or they are not God. Based on the way you describe them, they are not God. So there is only one God, and these other things are just God's attributes and not God, which means that there is no Trinity, or at least no triune God.
But they're comfortable talking about them as different characters.
Even though they're not different characters because they're all the same person. Right? Yes. No.
Yeah, this is part of the way that the biblical authors portray the one God's complex identity.
Why is his identity so complex, other than that he just wants it to be? Again, God sounds like he's making this process needlessly more complicated than it really needs to be.
They're God's attributes, and also distinct from God.
Yes, one's attributes are not the thing itself. A person being tall, like a person's height, is not the person. It is that person's height. It is an attribute of them, but it is not them. However, their person's height is not a separate character. It's not a separate person. It's not a separate entity. It is an aspect of them in the same way that your arm is an aspect of you. So again, there is only one God. There are no other characters. There are no separate entities. There is just one, and people are misunderstanding. Or am I wrong?
Distinct from God and also God.
No, they are not also God. They are distinct from God, point blank, period, end of sentence. In what way are these things also God? Your arm is a part of you, but it is not you. It's not like your arm is you and also distinct from you. That's not how that works. Your arm just isn't you, it's just a part of you. And when you take all the pieces of you, you get the actual you, but the pieces of you are not you. But you're saying the pieces of God is God, which isn't true. The pieces of a car is not a car. A tire is not a car, even if you put it together with other things and then it becomes a car. A tire is still not a car. An arm is still not a human. And an attribute of God is still not a God.
Yes, once we learn to spot that way of talking about God's identity,
Which is retarded and doesn't make sense.
you begin to see it all over the scriptures.
Yes, but even if you see it all over the scriptures, that doesn't mean that it makes sense. That doesn't mean that it isn't contradictory, and that doesn't mean that it solves the problem
In fact,
or the contradiction of the 3 equals 1 thing.
we find it in the first sentences of the Bible that mention the Spirit of God. So the opening line of the Bible is pretty familiar.
In the beginning, God created.
But then keep reading.
Which kind of sounds like God didn't create the beginning, but we're just going to not talk about that. That might be something for a separate video.
Who is it that we see within creation hovering over the waters?
The Spirit of God.
The Spirit refers to God's personal presence and energy that we can't interact with here within creation.
What does that mean? What is a personal presence and energy that we can interact with? How do you interact with God's personal presence and energy? Even then, is that God or is it not God? Because there are only 2 options. And if that is God and also not God, we have a contradiction and we have a problem. If it's God, then that's what God is. There's only one God and all the other stuff isn't God. If it's not God, then it's not God. Like I don't understand how this matters.
So the Bible can refer to God's Spirit as distinct from God.
It can try and it might even succeed, but then it would have to concede the point that God's Spirit is not God.
Distinct from God and also God.
How is it also God? You fail to answer that question. You make a very clear point to describe these things as separate and distinct from God and not being God, but then just say they're also God without explaining how they are also the thing that they describe.
It's God's Spirit. And while
Even if it's God's Spirit, your arm is not you. If we get rid of your arm, there's still a you. I don't understand. God's Spirit is not God in the same way that you are not your foot.
this sounds strange from our point of view,
Gee, I wonder why it sounds strange from our point of view. Will you explain to the audience why it sounds strange from our point of view, or are you just going to skip past that?
this complexity is what the biblical authors are trying to get us to see.
Why did the authors have to go through all this effort when God could make the process so much easier? Again, needlessly complicated.
So we've looked at God's attributes and God's Spirit. Now let's make our last stop exploring God's complex identity in the Hebrew Scriptures with the character called the Son of Man.
I would like to point out something. When you describe God's attributes, you describe God having multiple attributes, and those multiple attributes being perceived as separate and distinct characters, which goes outside of the Trinity thing. So to say God's wisdom is different than to say that God's wisdom, for example, is an attribute and is different from God's Spirit, and God has multiple attributes that are all God, then there are multiple gods within God's attributes. And then also the additional God of God's Spirit, and then also the additional God of the Son of Man. Do you not see the problem here? When you add the phrase also God, you are adding an additional God to the process. But okay, let's keep going. I don't know if I'm going to make it through the video, guys. I genuinely don't. I'm struggling here. I know I try to push it to our 2-hour mark, but this might be the video that breaks me.
So in the Bible, there's only one God that people are to worship, which
According to a book.
makes this story in the book of Daniel really surprising. Daniel has a dream about a human figure called the Son of Man.
Who called the human figure the Son of Man? I guess it doesn't matter, and we're just not going to talk about it, but, you know, I feel like that matters. when you're trying to describe important things. But go on.
which means a member of humanity. And Daniel drew.
So if that means a member of humanity, then he had a dream about a member of humanity. How so?
Dreams about this human getting elevated on a cloud, up and then higher up
into God's space.
God's space?
Yes, and then this human sits at the right hand of God's heavenly throne, and all humanity worships this human alongside God.
Because this human is not God, correct? Why are we worshiping something that isn't God? You go out of your way to express that this is a member of humanity, but we also should be worshiping a member of humanity? Is that a hill you really want to die on? Because I don't think it is.
The human where I expect to see God.
No, you just quite clearly said that it's in God's right hand. He's right next to God. So why would you expect God to be right next to God in God's space?
Yeah, this human is a part of God's identity.
A part of your identity is not you. Again, I don't know how many times I have to go over this. Your identity as a firefighter is not you. If the firefighter part of you no longer exists, you still will, meaning that they are two separate, distinct things. And the firefighter is not a separate character or being. It is still the exact same person cosplaying. I say cosplaying jokingly, but fulfilling a role.
Vision is about the climactic hope of the whole biblical story. God and humanity become one.
Meaning that they are not one and have to undergo a process to become one, which means they are also not three, which again, this is just messing up the Trinity all different kinds of ways, but okay.
So they can rule the world together as one. So,
putting aside the moral implications of ruling, which is apparently something God has a problem with, unless it's him doing the ruling, I don't understand why this would be the goal, or why this would be a desirable goal for anyone, including God. Why would God want to rule anything? Why would God care to rule anything? Why would you? Why would anybody? And that's not to say that nobody ever wants to rule. Obviously, people do. But it seems odd that a God would have such humane ambitions.
Man is distinct from God and also God.
Again, you keep saying the phrase also God without demonstrating how it is also God. You clearly said it's a human, a member of humanity sitting next to God, and you say, oh, okay, so it's also God. What?
Exactly.
Exactly what?
So, think back over everything we've looked at. In the Hebrew scriptures, God's identity is complex.
Complex for no good reason, I might add.
And so, when Jesus'
complex for seemingly no good reason.
followers encountered God as the Father, Son, and the Spirit, they already had categories for how these could all be the one God of the Bible.
Meaning that all of these different things are not actually different, they're just the same thing.
Okay.
If you say that they are the same thing and they are the same God, then there is no relevant distinction between them other than that's the costume God feels like wearing that particular day. So God didn't sacrifice his son. He doesn't have a son because the son is, by definition, separate and distinct from the Father. And this is the problem. If you want to say God has multiple body parts, you can do that. But what you can't do is say that the arm is the same thing as the leg, which is the same thing as the brain, which it's not. Even if they comprise the same human, they are not the same thing and they are not the same parts. And it is worth mentioning that the whole of the human could still be the whole of the human without those parts. Like I said before, a tire is not a car. Even if it's a part of a car, that doesn't mean that it's not a car and also a car. It just means it's a part of a car, which means it is not a car. I don't know how hard this concept is to grasp or why this concept is so hard to grasp and just say God likes to cosplay.
Let's talk about that.
Okay, so in the New Testament, we're introduced to Jesus of Nazareth, and he's human, but way more.
So he's a demigod.
his favorite title to call himself was the Son of Man.
which is not accurate. You cannot be both human and also not human. He either was human or he wasn't. There is no in between. And if you want to call him a mutant is still not human. They might have human attributes, but having human attributes and being human are not the same thing.
The figure in Daniel's vision.
And the claim
Just because he called himself Son of Man does not mean that he was the same figure in Daniel's vision. Because, as you said, that just refers to a member of humanity, meaning it could have been any member of humanity. And just because this member of humanity, like other members of humanity, claim to be God, not God, next to God in God space, doesn't mean that it specifically referred to Jesus, because Jesus was by no means unique in him claiming to be someone who was part God.
is that he is this complex God become human
Because why not?
to unite other humans with God.
Because obviously God was failing at that task before, so we had to do this now instead of at the beginning where it probably would have been more effective.
Okay, so the Gospels portray Jesus as fully human.
And how do they do that? I often hear people say this, but how is this the case? Beyond saying that Jesus is fully human, you cannot say he is fully human and also say that he is God, because those sentences are in direct contradiction with each other. Either he is half human, half God, whole human, not God, or whole God, not human. And if you think you have a way around this, you have to explain it better than just saying it's the thing, but also not the thing, because that is a direct logical contradiction. It's either A or it's not A. It can't be both A and not A. It's just not how that works.
And also, as Yahweh, the God of Israel, Jesus went around saying and doing things that only Yahweh can do.
How do you know the things he did were only things that Yahweh can do? Especially when Satan and demons were around and they could do magic tricks too.
Like forgiving people's sins.
What? Jesus is the only person that can forgive people's sins? Do people not forgive each other all the time? Do people not forgive each other's sins all the time? Is it functionally impossible for humans to forgive each other's sins? What?
Or calming the chaotic waters.
What chaotic waters? Are you talking about the waters in the deep in the beginning? At what point did it say he calmed the waters? I really want a verse for that one.
So they're saying Jesus is a human, distinct from God, and also God.
Again, there you go again with the also God thing. But you're not explaining how he's also God. You're just saying that. You need to understand that when you say Jesus is fully human, distinct from God means not God. And if you say and also God, you are contradicting yourself, which does not make sense and is not understandable to anyone else. Either he is human and distinct from God, or he is God and distinct from human. If you want to say he's a demigod and is part God, part human, say that. But don't say he's wholly distinct and wholly human. Just say he's a demigod. That would make this process so much easier. I mean, it wouldn't, because that still wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, but it would make more sense than this.
Yeah, and that might sound crazy.
Gee, why would that sound crazy? I don't like when people mention that the things that they say sound crazy, sound hard to believe, or they imply that there is a problem with the things that they're saying and they know what that problem is, but we're just not going to talk about it. We're going to skip past that because if you agreed with me, you'd be right.
Unless you've been reading the Hebrew scriptures, which prepared you for it.
Which basically means unless you already entered the conversation agreeing with me, then you'd be prepared for the things that I say. And of course, if someone already agrees with you, the things you say will be easier to digest. Is this for those people? Because if it is, then this was a waste of time. You just told people things you know they already know. And if this was made for other people who don't already agree with you, this is kind of an open admission that you are conveying this concept poorly because you have to appeal to people who already agree with you instead of just explaining it.
And then check this out. Jesus' first followers, the apostles, talked about his identity using the language of God's attributes.
So what? If they didn't do that, would that mean that he didn't have God's attributes?
They called Jesus the glory of God, or the apostle Paul called Jesus the wisdom of God.
They can call him whatever they like. Them calling him those things does not mean that he is those things. And even if he is, all that would mean is that he possesses the same attributes as God, and I also possess the same attributes as humans, minus the skin. I possess the same attributes as humans, but that does not mean that we're the same thing or we're the same person. We might be the same category of thing, but then you run into the problem of having more than one God, which is not what you're trying to say. So do you see the problem here? If you give Jesus' God attributes, that either makes him God or it doesn't. If it doesn't make him God, then he ain't God. It's like, then he ain't God, and you have that problem. Or it does make him God, and you have more than one God, and then you have that problem.
Or John opens his gospel calling Jesus the Word of God through whom the world was created.
So you have a bunch of dudes in the Bible who said some stuff, and we're going to do what with this information? The problem isn't that I'm expecting you to go through and verify the history of all the books. That's not what this is about. What this is about is A, how easily you just seem to accept the things that the Bible says, and B, how you don't seem to delve into an understanding of why these people said the things they did. You just pull up a person in the Bible that said a thing, and they were right because they were in the Bible and they said a thing, without actually laying out some sort of line of reasoning for us to follow. You just don't.
And then he says, the Word was with God and was God.
And he was not wrong because...
Okay, I get what they're doing, and it hurts my brain.
I don't get what they're doing. Or I do. They're trying to say 1 equals 3, and they're trying to come up with a bunch of nonsensical ways of saying 1 equals 3, but they're failing miserably because the vast majority of this video is just going out of your way to explain how distinct these things are from God, and then adding at the end, but also God. And at no point in this video have you demonstrated that these things are the same thing as God. You've just demonstrated that at best, they are parts of God. And parts of a car are not the car. A steering wheel is not a car. A seat is not a car. A tire is not a car. But these are also things that make up and comprise a car. But it would not be fair to say that the car is just the parts. Not all of the parts are equal to the sum of the parts. As you know this, 1 is a part of 3, but it is not 3. I don't know in what other way I can phrase this basic logical contradiction that you seem to be engaging in. I simply don't.
Totally. And if you want to spin your brain even more, consider this.
Why would I want to spin my brain even more? Oh yeah, because this is the thing that I do. This is how I contribute to society. I couldn't even say it with a straight face.
Jesus, who's portrayed as God become human, would talk to God as a distinct person.
Because they're not the same person, right? Or is God talking to himself? You only have 2 options. And I don't know how else. I'm tired, guys. I just don't know how else. It's either God is the one person or is the 2 people. You either have 2 gods or you got 1. You either have 2 gods having a conversation or you have 1 God talking to himself. Pick one.
And when he did, he called him Father.
Because he was talking to himself, which is not accurate because you cannot be your own father.
When Jesus talked about God, he wasn't referring to an abstract force or energy. He was talking about a personal being that you can relate to.
And how do you know that? Lots of people talk to the universe and beg the universe for things, but don't necessarily assume that the universe is its own entity.
There's a lot of personal images of God in the Bible: ruler, creator, judge.
But Jesus consistently referred to God as my Father.
Okay, and Jesus wasn't wrong because...
Jesus experienced God as a source of infinite love.
Jesus experienced himself as a source of infinite love. Or was that not him? Because those are your only 2 options. This is getting incredibly redundant.
He said, the Father has loved me since before the creation of the world.
The Father has loved himself before the creation of the world. if Jesus is God, that is what that functionally means.
Apparently, Jesus knew the Father as an eternally other-centered, life-giving being.
Or at least that's what he allegedly said.
Right, like in the story about Jesus' baptism, when the Father says from heaven, "This is my Son whom I love."
He was talking about himself, or he was talking about a separate entity that was not a God, or he was talking about a separate entity that was a God and Christians worship more than one God. You're not getting around this dichotomy. You're just saying stuff and saying they're different than God and then adding the phrase, but also God. And if you don't understand what's problematic about that, I really don't know what to do to help you.
And then keep reading. In that story, the person who brings that message of love from the Father to the Son is the Spirit of God.
Nope, I'm done. I can't. I'm done. I refuse. I am done with the video. I hereby end it. This has gotten so redundant. I refuse to go a single step further. I refuse to do it. I have suffered long enough. I have hit my 2-hour mark like I said I would, and I am absolutely done. If anyone watching this video after the fact can make any sense of that last video, just send a carrier pigeon, message me on Twitter, find a way to get in contact with me on YouTube, comment on the video, something, because I am done with this nonsensical 1 = 3 nonsense. I bid you all a fond farewell, and I will see you all next week for something that hopefully is not as boggling. So until then, I appreciate you. Not them, but you. A lot.